So, good morning, everybody. Hello. Thank you for joining us today. I am Agnes Adekine. I'm the program manager for Native Initiatives and director of the Circle of Indigenous Empowerment here at the Sonoran Center for Excellence in Disabilities at the University of Arizona. I am Dinesh Navajo, and I've been here for probably like a couple years now. But wanted to welcome you to today's webinar, which is moving from silos to systems to support survivors. And it's a webinar on how healthcare providers, advocates, legal professionals, and community organizations can work together to better support survivors of sexual violence through stronger partnerships and coordinated care. So our speaker today is Susan M. Wolf, PhD, Executive Director of Empowerment Research, LLC. So this session will also discuss the importance of brain injury screening for survivors, including those who have experienced strangulation or head injuries. So today's session is being recorded, and all recordings and materials will be available after captioning via email. If you'd like to ask a question, please type in your question in the chat box or use your raise hand button if you'd like to speak. So the presenter will be speaking for about 15 minutes, and the rest of the session will be question and answers and discussions and sharing of information. So if you do encounter any technical issues, please send a message in the chat to the Sonoran Center, who will be monitoring the chat. And if you'd like to also place in the chat where you're coming from, who you are, where you're from, that would also be helpful to our presenter today so that they would like to see who's available here online. And again, I will pass the microphone on to Sue, who will start our presentation today. Good morning, Sue.
Good morning, Agnes, and thank you so much for your support in bringing this information to light and to have a community discussion around what I believe is a critically important topic. My name is Dr. Sue Wolf, and I am, as Agnes said, the Executive Director at Empowerment Research. My background is in educational psychology, and I've spent the last 40 plus years in my career working in public health and education, providing training and technical assistance, especially around issues related to disability, very specifically around TBI and spinal cord injury. I wanted to quickly do some disclosures just so that you know that I am here of my own free will, wanting to support you all and to have a conversation and facilitate that talk. I do hold some other contracts, and I am receiving an honorarium from the U of A, but I have no non-financial relationships to disclose. But as far as the topic is concerned, my goal, as Agnes said, is to share a bit of information to set the stage, and then I'm going to present you with a scenario, and our conversation is going to revolve around this scenario. So unlike other webinars where you're expected to kind of sit and take in information, today's webinar is about your expertise, your experience, and coming to the table to share insights. Because I believe that this is a personality and passion-driven issue. And if we're going to make systems change, it has to come through us. As a result, the objectives are related very much to a better understanding of these concerns and how they impact service delivery. So I'm hoping that we can look beyond the silos that many of us exist in right now and talk about cross-silo collaboration. I was gifted with an opportunity through the Governor's Council many years ago to be part of the coordinated community response related to domestic violence, and it opened my eyes to so many things at the community level, and I loved facilitating community convening around these concerns. And now that all of us have been, trauma educated, the question is, how do we turn that into trauma-informed practices so that we can coordinate care? And ultimately, understanding our role in something that's not necessarily commonly addressed, which is universal brain injury screening. And when it relates to domestic violence survivors and specifically to sexual violence survivors, looking at the important role and the predictive ability for lethality related to strangulation. So I'm hoping that some of the epidemiological statistics aren't overwhelming, but at the same time do alert you to what really is going on in our field and the intersection between what we know about DV, interpersonal violence, and sexual violence, and what we understand about the long-term consequences of brain injury. We talk about how common it is. Most of you who work in the field know these data, right? 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men experience some form of physical interpersonal violence in their lifetime. When you look across studies, when you do large meta-analytic studies, the numbers range anywhere from 1 in 5 to 100% of people having experienced some form of brain trauma when we speak to survivors. And the numbers are obviously outrageous when we start talking about intimate partner violence and traumatic brain injury. I'm not always sure people are aware that the zones of injury have specific areas of impact, but what it says is, and the result of hitting the front of your head, 60% of the time we incur frontal lobe damage when it comes to assault. And what the implications of that are when you don't have strong executive functioning, when you are post-concussive. In a survey done through the center in Ohio, they spoke to survivors and 81% made comment that they'd actually lost count of the number of head injuries they had during these episodes. Too many to count. And when you're looking at upwards of 4 out of 5 individuals stating that that's our experience, we know that these are not one-time occurrences. And the data is not very rich at all. In fact, at least I have yet to find a lot of good data on knowing how many children actually experience hypoxic and anoxic episodes during sexual assault as children. And now that we're becoming very aware of sex trafficking in younger children, let alone with the ongoing concerns for decades now about missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, especially women and children, we have no idea the implications of these long-term consequences of head injury as it relates to interpersonal violence. I don't know how aware you are, and I can only thank Rachel Ramirez at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network for all of the work that she's done making us aware of this very important indicator. But strangulation now is probably the strongest warning sign we have that elevates lethality in a relationship. And it's shocking the number of people who talk about having been strangled once or more than once who were victims of violence. The number that was most shocking to me, and when she shared it in a webinar a few years ago, was that once strangulation has occurred, the likelihood that you are going to end up as a homicide victim rapidly increases. And we know that these are not one-time incidents. When we look at people who have attempted homicides, non-fatal strangulation is a reality. And so when someone discloses to you not only that they've had head injury, but that they're also a victim of a prior attempt at strangulation, red lights should be flashing, and everyone needs to be alerted to the mental health consequences, as well as the lethality of the current situation if that individual is still in that situation. When we look at what happens in these concerns, when we're dealing with multiple concussive episodes, when we're dealing with blunt force trauma to the frontal lobe, when we're dealing with strangulation and potential hypoxic and anoxic episodes, the long-term consequences are not things that we always think about when we're thinking about talking to the victim in front of us, talking to the survivor, or maybe we're encountering them much further along in a system where we're delivering services. Maybe it's lay legal advocacy. Maybe it's someone who's showing up at sheltering long after the initial harm or multiple repeated harms have been done. But I think it's worth recognizing that when the clients that are sitting in front of us, maybe it's family members across the dinner table, we have to be aware of the long-term consequences that are the result of these incidents of injury and harm. We know that the neurocognitive component is significant. We have well-documented evidence of problems with memory and concentration, ongoing persistent headache syndromes, right? Complaints of dizziness and tinnitus, light and noise sensitivity, balance problems. Sometimes people present with all these concerns medically, but then we don't go back and ask the questions, well, how did you get this way? Have you always been this way? When did that change? Add to that the psychiatric components. We know that many people who experience interpersonal violence leave those situations, if they survive, number one, with mild, moderate, and severe PTSD. Many of them come from abusive childhoods at home and seek similar relationships, resulting in more violence, and can be presenting with small c PTSD, complex PTSD from long-term childhood trauma. We may also be seeing issues of depression and anxiety, and that many of these are co-occurring because of these partner-inflicted brain injuries. This creates a very, very complicated situation for dealing with the client and looking for positive outcomes in recovery, whether that's engaging in their own safety plan in a way that's meaningful. After you've spent a lot of time developing a safety plan, do they have the capacity and the capability of carrying it out? Or are we seeing someone who's post-concussive, brain injured, and possibly hypoxic, who even with good documentation can't figure out how to leave? Right? So these comorbidities become incredibly difficult, and many times they end up finding people going into situations seeking care for the psychiatric concerns, and we don't delve back deep enough to do universal screening and ask, how did you get this way? What happened to you? Have you always been like this? When we talk about the scale of the problem, majority of individuals who identify as survivors talk about having experienced brain injury. So to think that it is only happening to a small minority of the individuals that we serve is definitely inaccurate. And then when we look at the level of severity, we see that it is positively associated with higher levels of PTSD symptoms and other comorbidities. One of the issues that we don't spend a lot of time talking about is the comorbidity of addiction, chemical and substance addiction, process addictions, and other psychiatric disorders post-brain injury. And I feel that many times what we miss when we send people off to 12-step programs, inpatient long-term treatment programs, is an inability, again, to screen and document for prior head injury. In my work in chemical dependency over the years, in community-based programs, I can tell you that what is a consistent theme amongst people I have interviewed, whether they are homeless and panhandling in the parking lots at bashes on reservation lands, or whether they are down and out and at the food banks down in downtown Phoenix. When you start talking to people about long-term sobriety, about the willingness to have solutions that create continuous sobriety, one of the biggest correlates I see in the people that I've interviewed over the last, 25 years, is that people who struggle with continuous sobriety have had a brain injury prior to the age of 15 with a loss of consciousness. Now, have I been able to get that data published? Not yet. Am I working on it? Absolutely. But we talk about in recovery and in chemical dependency programs this concept of continuous sobriety. And yet what I see consistently, especially when I'm working in medium secure and minimally secure facilities for Department of Corrections, tribal lands or not, when you start talking to people about why they're in there and what's going on, most individuals I speak with have issues with addiction and chemical dependency, and they struggle to keep long-term sobriety. We have got to begin having those conversations about early brain injury as a result of childhood abuse, interpersonal violence, or just, the recklessness of adolescence. But nevertheless, a lot gets missed. And I think the challenges for individuals who are coming to services for us having experienced sexual violence is we have a lot of challenges because if there's no marks, we think no injury. And yet what the data continue to review is that half the strangulation cases don't leave any visible signs. It's not like abusive head trauma with children where it's so significant that a shaken infant and a shaking toddler has marks left on their rib cage. There's signs of cotton wool in their retinal imaging. We don't see that necessarily in strangulation cases of children and adults. But it doesn't mean that a clean exam with no physical evidence doesn't mean that there wasn't harm. Number one. Number two, and I am so thankful to the people who choose law enforcement as a career, but it is definitely not an easy job. When looking at excited utterances at the scene and trying to figure out who's the combatant and who's the victim, many times it's not clear. And when we get inconsistent statements from victims, how much of that inconsistency isn't just trauma related, but it may also be related to memory and processing difficulties as that person is trying to figure out how to get their wits about them, having just been concussed. And many times those long-term consequences still play out in the courtroom, still play out when speaking to defense attorneys, if they're identified as the aggressor. Or they're there on the behalf of being the witness and the victim, right? We see this inconsistency that doesn't make for strong legal cases and many times undermines those cases in terms of successful prosecution. We also see that there's a lot of symptomology overlapping, right? Between PTSD and TBI, many of those symptoms look very, very similar. Higher levels of anxiety, flashbacks, nightmares, difficulty processing, migraine headaches. And without screening and properly understanding, have you had a head injury? Have you been strangled? Has this happened more than once? We may easily mistake one disorder for another and send people down service delivery systems that have no idea how to adequately respond to the services that someone who's post-concussive needs. Things like cognitive rehabilitation, occupational therapy, speech and language therapies, and long-term supports potentially in vocational employment. Addressing further undocumented means unusable. If we don't ever screen, we can't inform those other systems of the vulnerability of this victim. So many times what gets missed because we're not screening can be misread, misinterpreted, and we can send individuals who are already vulnerable victims, survivors, and hoping someday to become thrivers. We may inevitably send them through a doorway that can't address what's really going on. So I don't know how much of this is resonating with you, but if you want to throw some thumbs up or hearts into that emoji world, it would be wonderful. If not, some comments in the chat would let me know that I'm kind of moving in the right direction and I might be actually talking to people and preaching to the choir. I don't know, but I'm certainly hoping that that what's going on here is making sense to you and is seen as valuable. I want to take just a minute to address that this scenario I'm going to share with you next is a tiny, tiny piece of a much larger, much more complicated continuum of care when someone experiences a brain injury. I'm hoping that this conversation is a part of recognition, and I hope we're getting to people and identifying individuals at the place where each of us personally can make a difference. But this scenario is simply addressing this tiny, not tiny, I mean, it's a huge part, but a very small piece of acute care when we talk about a journey. Because many individuals who experience brain injury don't ever see acute care. They don't interface with medical systems. They don't want their neighbor to call 911. It may change their level of safety and security. Many people don't address the fact that what they've experienced is indeed traumatic brain injury. Many people never ever get to this system. But if they do, we may encounter them at various stages along this continuum, and without screening, we don't know that there should be recognition of the problem. We may not meet the client because they never saw this system, and we only meet them in our work as a lay legal advocate. We may only see them when they apply to vocational rehabilitation and now their intake as a client with us, and we'd like to have a successful case closure. And yet, we may miss the opportunity to provide very specialized services through a neuro rehab unit within VR that addresses the specific needs of clients with traumatic brain injuries and spinal cord injuries, and sometimes those both being comorbid to the other. So if we don't even get people to the right services within systems because we don't recognize the problem, again, we're not providing the most appropriate services to this individual who is now recognized as someone with a disability. Comments in the chat? Agnes, I see a little one.
So this is Agnes. Yes, we have one from Memory. Memory states, this is the single most underreported tactic of abuse in our work. The impacts are long-lasting and sometimes permanent.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I'm really glad that this is resonating and that it's validating your personal and professional experience. Thank you. So this diagram in front of you probably could be a hour and a half conversation. And if I were doing this work in a stakeholders meeting in community, this is where I would start. The work that I've done with numerous safe home programs across the state, these were the kinds of conversations we had about where does someone come into the system. Is it an optometrist, right, who has to fill an eyeglass prescription reorder because the frames and the glasses were broken in the assault? You know, how do victims come to us? Is that frantic call to a 911 operator? Where in the system of services, and the medical system is simply one piece, but it's a very convoluted piece when one has a brain injury. So what I want to discuss with you is a scenario based partially on an experience from a student of mine in previous years while I was working in undergraduate education. We will refer to the client as Dawn, 19 years old, assaulted by someone she knows, and she lives in a relatively remote area of native lands, and this happens on a late Friday night. The nearest hospital with any sexual assault nurse examiner capacity available is 3 hours away. The closest facility, which is a local IHS clinic, has no sane trained staff available, as it's minimally staffed at night when she calls in at 1 a.m. and is seeking help. So I would just like to know, in your work, if you could put a 1 into the chat. Is this a scenario that is what you would consider to be feasible? That this is a typical kind of reality for the clients that you serve?
We have absolutely, yes, definitely feasible, a one, a one.
Okay, great. Just as long as I've got some assurance that that we're in the right space. I want to add to this, and it's not part of this scenario. Oh, I'm sorry, Agnes. It seems to me more coming in. I apologize.
Yes, there's also another comment. The lack of available services for Indigenous survivors of violence is the reality.
Okay, thank you. Um, I didn't choose some of the other cases where, I've been exposed to this issue, which relates to whether or not this individual is a minor, right? Whether or not this young person was a juvenile runaway, maybe an individual who's been trafficked for labor trafficking, sex trafficking, whatever, or that this individual has comorbidities of mental health concerns and addiction. I didn't want to complicate the scenario because that adds layers of conversation that we can't possibly get through in an hour. But I think, as you've already identified, this is a pretty reasonable scenario. And there are areas where we're challenged, right? We're challenged depending upon where the assault occurred. Was it on tribal trust lands or was it in a border community in an adjacent county, right, that butts up to those lands? Was this person assaulted by a native? Was this person assaulted by a non-native? And all these jurisdictional issues cloud the response because sometimes all three authorities claim partial responsibility. Sometimes there are other agencies that may assume one agency's got it handled. We don't need to worry about it. And sometimes none of them move quickly. Is there anybody online who would like to share their experience with jurisdictional challenges? You're welcome to chat or open your microphone.
So in the chat, memory states jurisdiction remains the largest legal barrier in addressing sexual violence in tribal communities.
Well, I think that pretty much sums it up, Memory. Thank you.
So my name is Memory Dawn Longtrace. I'm the Domestic Violence Response Director for SWIC, or Southwest Indigenous Women's Coalition, Arizona Statewide Tribal Domestic and Sexual Violence Coalition. A huge part of my job is to go to non-Native service providers and explain the Indigenous experience with regard to jurisdiction. That remains the largest legal barrier in response to sexual violence in tribal communities, which is a huge indicator of the systemic issues with violence response in tribal communities. The population with the highest rates of violence have the largest amount of legal barriers to accessing safety and justice. And we're just talking about the legal barriers. We're not talking about the psychosocial response, etc., comes along with 500 years of colonization. If you want to have a larger conversation, Sue, I am your girl.
And I would love to teach and facilitate with you. I love finding people in my world, and you are a gift presented today, Memory. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
being. Oh my gosh, fantastic. I appreciate your passion. I appreciate your concern, and I definitely appreciate the role you're carrying because it's a huge one. As you suggested, I'm going to use your comment as a segue to the medical response because that's another area where we continue to see some challenges, right? Um, we've got on-call folks who can treat immediate issues, can offer emergency contraception, can look at STDs and be concerned, but without sane trained professionals, forensic evidence collection is limited or unavailable on site. And when you combine that with the reality for my student, where she was told that she'd need to drive 3 hours in order to get a forensic exam, and it's a trip that, in all honesty, she didn't have a vehicle for, she didn't have any gas money for, nor did she really have a lot of friends or family support for someone to take her there at 1 a.m. in the morning and show up at a hospital at 4 a.m. and hope that she could get a rape kit done and try to figure out how to begin to redesign her life with what's actually occurring. So, what are your thoughts about the challenges for this victim? What are your thoughts? This is kind of where the discussion comes in. And I'm super good with waiting because I was a teacher for a long time and I got great wait time.
I'll go ahead and comment just because I'm trying to type, but my L key doesn't seem to work very well.
Go ahead,
Um,
Memory.
yeah, sorry. I'm gonna come off camera. I wasn't planning to because I have been doing my grant reporting all morning, so it's not webinar ready. But this is a common scenario, and so my gut response is that she did not seek the medical forensic exam because of all of the barriers to accessing that. So the broader implications of that is that it probably wasn't reported to law enforcement. If it wasn't reported to law enforcement, there isn't a record of it. So there's zero accountability for the perpetrator, zero option for justice, and a safe medical response is out of reach. This is a very, very, very common scenario in tribal communities.
Absolutely.
Oh shoot, I forgot I had that background on my Zoom. Sorry.
It's perfect. Oh, I wouldn't change a thing. You are a deadly auntie. It's fabulous. And I'm sure there are people commenting that they absolutely love it. Because we need folks like you, Memory. We
Thank
need
you.
folks like you. I love it. Your heart is beautiful. Anything else in the chat, Agnes?
Um, okay, just memories, chats, and then Sabine says she might not go at all because of all the obstacles, lack of services, and of course, mention of memories background. Definitely need more deadly aunties in this space. Thank you, Memory, for
Oh,
the
love it.
inspiration there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the reality of the situation is, as both of you identified, the likelihood that this victim is going to seek services um, is very, very, very slim. And it's going to take systems change at the local level, as well as systems change at much higher levels in order for things to become different. We're in 2026, and I can tell you that we were having these same conversations over 20 years ago when we established the Adabi program in Chinle. We were having these same conversations as domestic violence shelters were being planted in rural places like Safford, Arizona, right? These conversations are ongoing. And the question is, how do we, the few, impact the many who are part of these very, very complicated concerns? When we look and move from jurisdictional to medical and from medical down to law enforcement, the reality, I think for those of us who live on tribal lands and work on tribal lands, we're much more aware. But there are also very, very remote areas of Arizona that are non-tribal that have just as limited resources when it comes to law enforcement. And as I've seen and was witness to the 8 years that I lived in the Four Corners area, a limited number of officers are available in any 24-hour shift. And for example, Navajo Nation alone, there's 27,000 square miles to that landmass, crossing multiple state lines, which creates more jurisdictional issues within a sovereign nation. And the reality of what we see in rural communities in many areas, both native and non-native, is that small communities, people know people, right? This responding officer knows Dawn, and she potentially knows the individual who assaulted her, right? I see a hand up. Oh my gosh. Hi, Donna Treetop. How are you?
Hi, Dr. Wolf. It's great to hear your voice and to see you on screen. I'm doing good, thank you. Could you go back to the previous slide?
Oh, I absolutely can. How's that?
Good.
You bet.
Sorry to add a late response to this slide,
No.
but I was kind of like processing everything you were saying. And what I noticed about the red box at the bottom is that it lists all of the external barriers that she's dealing with in this situation. But
Hmm.
what feels like is missing to me is like the internal, barriers. And I don't know if this was Dawn's, first assault, but I feel like when you go through an assault of any kind, that, there's the psychological trauma factor. And you don't, if it's your first time, dealing with, a life-threatening situation that you actually survived, then you don't fully realize, what you're going through. And so I feel like that should be added to the red box, just for a more complete picture of the barriers of what she's facing. You know, um, anyway, just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Thank you. And I so appreciate you and all the work that you do within this community. And it is absolutely lovely to see you on this webinar. I love when we get to cross paths.
Exactly. Thank you.
And you bring up a very, very valid point. And there's actually a slide after law enforcement that you are the perfect segue towards, which I call the trust layer. So we're coming up on that shortly, and I think you'll just, the light bulbs, and you'll be going, yes, that's exactly what I meant, because it definitely relates to this bigger issue of what's going on at this much deeper, long-standing, and I'll call it a policy concern of what has been traditionally happening, beyond the issue of law enforcement. So within the concerns of knowing victim and perpetrator, in rural communities, because so many people are related, stay in small towns, have a lot of history there. A lot of times people aren't always held accountable. I have still been watching the courts here, for a murder that occurred a couple years ago, and the individual who murdered his wife still has not seen his first day in court. And I watched the minute entries in the county register because his wife was a dear friend of mine and multiple other colleagues in this small town that we live in. And there has been no accountability on behalf of this individual, in the death of his wife. And he is still sitting in jail. And I just keep wondering how that stuff happens, and yet I know it goes on. And so there's personalities, there's people, there's systems, and there's all kinds of things that occur in the background, especially in rural communities where there's not as much oversight, where there are these old fashioned networks, I won't put gender to them, that exist and protect, right? And then we add, oh, there's a comment. I'm sorry, I missed a comment or two. I got a number 2 on my screen, Agnes.
Yep. So anyway, so memory just states that she does do a history of sexual violence in Indian country,
Okay.
especially about deeper, multifaceted history of the weaponization of public policy. So to connect with her, and then another comment: how will they deal with the perpetrator and the affected families, um, not to repeat the same thing?
Boy, isn't that a really grand question? Um, and I appreciate the question because it brings up a very, I'll call it a volatile conversation point. Because if no one presses charges, if no one is held accountable, the likelihood that those behaviors change is very limited. And um, we have some very successful perpetrator treatment programs, and we have some very not successful perpetrator treatment programs. The statistics are pretty overwhelming that a majority of perpetrators were at one point victims in their childhood, And I think that programs that have accepted that and dealt with that as part of their anger management strategy, validation, generational trauma, and components of those systems have found a bit more success. But if someone is not held accountable, the likelihood is that the perpetration will continue. And that, unfortunately, is a stark fact. And for many individuals who are missing, there's even less accountability because now there's no one to speak their truth. So the system has a long way to go. But the one thing we can do is that the service providers who are providing services to surviving victims in order to help move them on their journey towards thriving, if we can be more collaborative and cooperative and see ways to understand our interface with one another and recognize this problem of brain injury, I think we're going to be a lot further down the road to having at least different discussions and being able to possibly make some different decisions, especially when we can create universal screening as policies within our programs, which is something most of us can personally do one-on-one. Comment before I get on to the trust layer.
Yes. A person asked, what are the good and bad programs? You mentioned 60% were victims. Where can I look more into this?
Okay.
And then the other is, of course, memory, stating with regard to accountability for perpetrators, we recognize that violence is a learned behavior. As a movement, I think we are overly reliant on the criminal justice system for accountability, which takes a more nefarious tone in Indian country as we are still governed by the Major Crimes Act of
Exactly.
1885 and the Oliphant parameters.
Parameter.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Excuse me. There are a couple meta-analytic studies that I can pull up after this session's over. I can put my email is actually on the last slide, and I will be glad to follow up with you and anyone else in this conversation. There's a couple meta-analytic studies of the efficacy of different perpetrator intervention programs that go beyond just quote-unquote anger management. And we've actually found that some of the programs that are involved that are more like dual diagnosis programs, meaning we're dealing not only with perpetrator violence, but also maybe the comorbidity of addiction, seem to be having some pretty good success even within the residential treatment communities as well. So I would be glad to follow up with you after this meeting. I know that we have new programs that are coming online that do not have what I would call peer-reviewed, validated journal publications around them. However, the efficacy of their initial reporting to stakeholders and board members is certainly looking like it's moving towards promising and best practice. I know that the New Destiny program down in the urban area south of Phoenix in Queen Creek is having some pretty amazing results, but their approach has been a behavioral health approach, and all of their residents are required, whether they're for diversion, chemical dependency, anger management. How you get there is irrelevant, but it is a community-based program with a 12-step foundation for the addictions component. But the biggest piece is it's integrated with traditional teachings and practices. So the men in the program have exposure to all staff who are behaviorally health trained as a minimum of technicians, many of them with their bachelor's and master's degrees. So you're getting a comprehensive therapeutic environment at New Destiny. And I am hoping that Shauna and her husband do get to create some peer-reviewed journal publications from their work, because it is extremely promising and the recidivism rate is very, very low, below 10%. So there's a lot of opportunity for looking at programs, and I'll be glad to get you those research studies if it's of interest to you.
That
and
would
share
be
it with
great.
everybody.
Yeah, this is Agnes. That'd be great. And I think also, you know, looking at the perpetrator, you mentioned earlier in your slides and presentation that
Mm,
of people who have traumatic brain injuries before they are adults have a tendency for long-term addiction. And if we see that the high numbers of child abuse in young men, you see that as increasing, maybe increasing addiction and increasing violence and becoming
absolutely.
perpetrators. And so having a program that focuses on all aspects is really key, because, they are victims as well in terms of the abuse that they suffered from, and then, of course, the traumatic brain injury and everything else. And so, not to
Absolutely.
say that victims are not the only one, but also, you know, perpetrators
Absolutely.
also need to be seen as victims as well, especially our Native men. And we do
Absolutely.
not talk that much about Native men and the victimization that they faced as well.
Well, and I think that's part of the reason I have been very impressed and spent a couple days actually observing the program in practice because of a need to find um, indigenous based programs where traditional healing, traditional medicine, and beliefs that stem across tribal lands are definitely taken in and are part of the backbone of the program. Everything from, men's sweat, traditional singing, drumming. There are some wonderful components to that program, which is why I believe that it is highly successful, is addressing that every client at some point has been a victim. So I agree with you 100%, Agnes. So as we're kind of sort of getting to wrap up here, I did want to suggest that this trust layer is a huge piece. That I think that it's a place where we can at least begin to see that the role of universal screening and the ability to listen to one's story, validating one's experience by asking about brain injury, is actually an empathetic place where we can connect with people and we can begin to honor the fact that they don't trust the system. And that if we come from a place of a lack of trust, then we know that the one place that's most critical for us is to build rapport. And if we can build rapport through a form of universal screening that improves systems and builds trust, that someone's actually willing to ask about why I'm struggling and not just look at me as a person who is struggling, becomes a different way to have conversations and support people in delivery of services. So I offered some opportunities. One of the sets of documents that I have available and will gladly share with all of you. These are 3 different tools that we use ongoingly in universal screening programs. I love the tool in the middle because it was actually the work done by Rachel Ramirez, who I just kind of go mentor extraordinaire. And she took the tool on the left and with some insights from us with our tool on the right as kind of a medical provider's documentation of injury and resulting concerns, she created the tool that's in the middle, and you have access to all of them, and they're also quoted in the references page at the last of this presentation, and it should be in your handouts in the PDF. I'm sure Agnes is probably going to be popping them into the chat because I think she said she was going to do that. But if you aren't, Agnes, if you could, if you already are, thank you. But these are ways to begin universal screening procedures in your programs, understanding that to screen and do nothing is unethical. To screen and have a follow-up to a positive response is what's required for real policy. And when we think about this story, I tried to kind of say, gee, if we could have an ideal world, what would this look like, right? No logistical support for this young gal who is out there on the other side, 5 miles from the Arizona-New Mexico border and 20 miles south of Four Corners. What would that system look like, right? Maybe we would have, holy cow, here we go. I gotta go back, get back here a second. Hmm. I had slides for, well, there was a part of that slide that's supposed to show up that says coordinated trauma-informed system, where we would have a regional SANE guide that is available through telehealth, right? And it's available in real time. And that we'd have universal strangulation and head trauma screening that happens by default before any evidence or jurisdictional concern is even discussed, that this screening system is in place, and that we have the technology to actually have telehealth as a guide on the side to ensure that whatever medical system she shows up at, there is support and concern for her, right? Siloed responses. What can law enforcement do within its jurisdiction, right? In an informed system, we would see, and I have no idea why these are disappearing, glitch in the universe, glitch in the fabric. Can't explain it, but I can read you what's on the slide. And speak to you from experience, that if I've got standing tribal agreements, if these agreements between tribal and county are built ahead of time, a 5-minute phone call can resolve who's taking the report, right? So that we're looking at the survivor's care and we provide continuity regardless of that outcome. That's a coordinated trauma-informed system where we figure these things out before the victim is presented to us. And we create these agreements well ahead of time. And ultimately, understanding that the issues that Dawn and her family have experienced from a broken system and broken policies doesn't mean that that has to be her experience, right? That there should be a tribal victim advocate. I mean, you've heard Memory this morning, passionate about making sure that individuals have access to services around the clock, right? A tribal victim advocate, available, reachable at 1 a.m., a single point of contact. Because these relationships already exist. We're not trying to figure them out in the middle of the heat of what's going on. It's because we've already had conversations and we've made the community aware of accessible resources. Comments? Agnes in the chat. Looks like there are several.
Oh yes, there's some conversation and some networking going on regarding SANE nurse SANE program at the U of A and how they are providing funding for providers to get a stipend for attending. So would love to see more Indigenous or at least Indigenous serving providers attend the training so that folks have closer access to forensic evidence collection. Please feel free to point people in the direction of the training or reach out to us if you'd like to brainstorm some ways that we can make this happen. So there's also a link to the program in the chat, and Memory says, yes, we need to connect. We're currently writing a grant. So and says, excellent. Yes, we're thinking about the same thing. So they're connecting together.
I love it. I love it because then silos, our structures, and what's happening in this chat is just one example of how systems can be a choice, right? So as you're sitting here today, what can you, as a person leaving this 55-minute experience right now, agree that you can commit to doing with this information? Being validated by it, being challenged by it? What are things that you believe within your system you can do today? Is universal screening an option? Can you have that conversation with someone in your organization? Is this a conversation you're going to take back to your dinner table tonight? Are you going to be that auntie who calls that family member and says, let's get involved? Throw your ideas in the chat. I'm fascinated to hear them. And Agnes, thank you so much for watching the chat.
Okay, Shauna says, as a native Hawaiian, being a part of training sane nurses in Hawaii, where some islands have one or none at all, has meant so much to me and my family of courageous survivors.
Oh, heart.
So thank you for all the information. Thank you. This has been fantastic.
And I did add all the references for the epidemiological statistics that were involved, and I will definitely follow up regarding effective and shown to be effective best practices in perpetrator treatment. I have it on my to-do sticky list.
So thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. Just to make an announcement that we'll have another webinar in this series next week. So both Memory, Dawn, Long Chase, and I will have a presentation on complex post-traumatic stress disorder and the impact of prolonged trauma on emotional regulation, self-perception, and reception and relationships. Sorry. So there's a link to the webinar registration in the chat that I just posted right now. And the Soren Center has also posted, again, more information about that. Let me see. Remember to also fill out your evaluation. We look at the evaluation very closely to see what other webinars we need to focus on, where we need to improve. We also have a couple of people who responded. I work at a K through 8th grade school and wish we could use this at our school. Thank you very much.
Oh, glad to come and help.
Mhm.
Treating
Another
a technical
individual.
assistant.
Okay, cool. So another individual says, I am committing to doing more to raise awareness of the services available and the training options for medical providers and advocates. Thank you.
Yes, I love it.
Another individual stated, study and disseminate screening tools, get familiar with resources and organizations available.
Wonderful. It's a personality, passion-driven commitment for change. And I challenge each of us here to continue to try to carry that torch. And thank you for the opportunity, Agnes, to come and speak today. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for taking your time today to be here as well.